Eleanor Hartley's hands shook as the carriage door slammed shut behind her, sealing her away from the only life she had ever known. Outside, rain hammered against the small window, blurring the shape of her father's house until it disappeared completely behind a curtain of gray. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, as if she could hold on to the image a moment longer, but it was gone. "You will thank me one day," her father had said that morning, refusing to meet her eyes. "The Duke of Ashfield is a good match. This marriage saves us all." Eleanor had not answered him. What was there to say? Her family's debts had grown too large to hide, and a duke's offer of marriage was the only rope thrown to a drowning household. She was the rope. She had no illusions about that. The carriage rattled over uneven stones, carrying her farther from everything familiar and closer to a man she had met only once, for less than 10 minutes, in a drawing room full of strangers. Duke Edward Whitmore. She remembered little about him except that his eyes had been unreadable, and his voice had been quiet, almost too quiet, as though speaking too loudly might break something fragile in the room. By the time the carriage rolled through the iron gates of Ashfield Manor, the rain had turned into a fine mist that clung to the trees lining the long drive. The house itself rose out of the fog like something carved from stone and shadow, its windows dark except for a few scattered lights on the ground floor. Eleanor's stomach twisted. This was to be her home now. This cold, silent place with its high walls and closed doors. A footman helped her down from the carriage, and she stood for a moment on the wet gravel, looking up at the manor. She thought of her mother, gone 3 years now, and wondered what she would have said if she could see her daughter standing here, about to marry a man she barely knew. "Miss Hartley." The voice startled her. She turned to find Duke Whitmore standing at the top of the stone steps, watching her with the same unreadable expression she remembered from their first meeting. He wore no coat despite the chill, and his dark hair was damp, as though he had been standing outside for some time before her arrival. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into a curtsy that felt stiff and awkward, her body unused to the formality this new life demanded. "You must be tired from the journey," he said. "Come inside, there is a fire in the drawing room." He did not offer his arm. He did not smile. He simply turned and walked back into the house, leaving her to follow or not as she chose. Eleanor felt a flicker of anger beneath her exhaustion. She had given up everything to come here, and he could not even pretend to be pleased about it. Still, she followed him inside, because there was nowhere else to go. The drawing room was warm, at least, with a fire crackling in the hearth and heavy curtains drawn against the darkening evening. A tea tray had already been set out, though it looked untouched. Eleanor sat where the Duke gestured, perched at the edge of a velvet chair, her spine straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "The wedding will take place in 3 days," he said without preamble. "My sister has arranged everything. You need not concern yourself with the details." 3 days, Eleanor repeated, the words tasting strange in her mouth. She had known the marriage was arranged quickly, but hearing the exact number of days remaining felt like a door closing. "Is that too soon?" For the first time, something flickered across his face, something that might have been concern, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "No," she said, because what else could she say? "It is fine." He studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor forced herself not to look away, though every instinct told her to. There was something in his gaze that unsettled her, not cruelty, not even coldness exactly, but a kind of distance, as though he were looking at her from very far away. "You are frightened," he said finally. It was not a question, and Eleanor did not bother denying it. "Wouldn't you be, Your Grace, if you were sent to live in a stranger's house and marry a man you had spoken to only once?" She expected him to be offended by her bluntness. Instead, something almost like respect crossed his features. "I would be," he admitted. "Though I have been assured by everyone around me that this arrangement benefits us both, your family's debts will be settled. My estate will gain the connections it requires. It is, by every practical measure, a good match." "Practical?" Eleanor echoed softly. "Yes, I suppose it is." She thought of the marriages she had once dreamed of as a girl, before her father's debts had swallowed those dreams whole. She had imagined love, or at least warmth, some spark of feeling between two people who chose each other freely. This was nothing like that. This was two strangers being fitted together like pieces of a puzzle neither of them had chosen to solve. "I will not pretend to offer you affection I do not yet feel," the Duke said, as though reading her thoughts. "But I will offer you respect, and I will expect the same in return. Beyond that, I ask only that you make yourself comfortable here. This house has been too quiet for too long." Elinor glanced around the grand room, taking in the empty corners, the portraits of stern-faced ancestors staring down from the walls, the silence that seemed to press in from every direction despite the crackling fire. Too quiet, he had said. She wondered what he meant by it, what history lived in these walls that made a duke, a man who should have wanted for nothing, speak with such quiet weariness. "I will try, your grace," she said, and meant it, though she did not yet know how she would manage such a thing. He nodded once as though the matter were settled and rose from his chair. "Margaret will show you to your rooms. Rest tonight. Tomorrow, my sister Charlotte will call on you to discuss the wedding arrangements." "Thank you," Elinor said, though gratitude was not quite what she felt. Relief, perhaps, that the conversation was over. Exhaustion, certainly, from the long journey and the longer day. He paused at the doorway, his hand resting against the frame, and for a moment Elinor thought he might say something more. But he only glanced back at her once, his expression unreadable again, before disappearing down the darkened hallway. A young woman appeared moments later, introducing herself as Margaret, the housekeeper who had served the Whitmore family for over a decade. She led Elinor up a wide staircase and down a long corridor lined with closed doors, finally stopping at one near the end. "This will be your room, miss," Margaret said, pushing the door open to reveal a spacious chamber with a large bed, a writing desk by the window, and a fire already burning low in the grate. "The Duke asked that it be prepared special for you." Elinor stepped inside, running her fingers over the smooth wood of the desk, the soft blanket folded at the foot of the bed. It was a beautiful room, more beautiful than anything she had known in her father's modest house. And yet it felt hollow, unfamiliar, like a costume she had been asked to wear before she understood the play. "Is there anything you need, miss?" Margaret asked. Elinor shook her head, though 100 questions crowded her mind. What kind of man was the Duke, truly, beneath that careful distance? Why did the house feel so heavy with silence, as though grief lived in its very walls? What had he meant, too quiet for too long? "No, thank you, Margaret. I think I only need to rest." The housekeeper curtsied and left, closing the door softly behind her. Elinor sat on the edge of the enormous bed, listening to the rain return outside, tapping gently against the window glass. 3 days. In 3 days she would be the Duchess of Ashfield, bound forever to a man whose sadness she could sense but not yet understand. She thought again of her father's words, "You will thank me one day." She did not believe them, not yet. But as she looked around the quiet, beautiful room that was now hers, she found herself hoping, in some small and stubborn corner of her heart, that perhaps he might be right after all. Sleep did not come easily that night. Elinor lay awake long after the fire had burned down to embers, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the manor settling around her, the distant creak of old wood, the whisper of wind through the trees outside her window. Somewhere in this house, behind one of those countless closed doors, the Duke was likely awake too, carrying whatever weight made his eyes so distant, his voice so careful. She did not know him. She did not know what waited for her beyond these 3 days. But as exhaustion finally pulled her toward sleep, Elinor made herself a quiet promise. Whatever this marriage became, whatever silence or sadness filled the halls of Ashfield Manor, she would not simply disappear into it. She would find a way to live, truly live, even here, even now, even bound to a stranger by circumstance rather than choice. The rain continued long into the night, and somewhere beyond her window, an owl called out once into the darkness, as though marking the beginning of something neither of them yet understood. Morning came gray and slow, light seeping through the curtains rather than breaking through them. Elinor woke to the sound of a servant lighting the fire, and for one confused moment she forgot where she was. Then the memory returned, heavy and immediate, and she sat up, smoothing her tangled hair from her face. "Good morning, miss," the young maid said, not looking up from her work at the hearth. "Mrs. Margaret said you should take breakfast whenever you wake. There's no rush." Elinor thanked her and rose, crossing to the window to look out over grounds she had not been able to see clearly the night before. The mist had lifted somewhat, revealing gardens that stretched far beyond what she could have imagined, hedges trimmed into careful shapes, a stone path winding toward what looked like an old chapel in the distance. It was beautiful in a quiet, guarded sort of way, much like the man who owned it. She dressed carefully, choosing one of the few good gowns she had brought with her, and made her way downstairs, following the sound of voices toward what she assumed was the breakfast room. She found the Duke already seated at the long table, a newspaper folded beside his plate, though he was not reading it. "You slept well, I hope," he said, rising slightly as she entered, a small courtesy that surprised her. "Well enough, your grace," Elinor answered, taking the seat a servant pulled out for her. They ate in near silence for several minutes, the only sounds the soft clink of silverware and the crackle of the fire in the corner. Elinor found herself studying him without meaning to, the tired lines around his eyes, the way his gaze occasionally drifted toward the window as though searching for something beyond the glass. "My sister will arrive within the hour," he said eventually. "Charlotte can be direct. I hope you will forgive her enthusiasm. She has wanted a wedding in this family for some time." "I look forward to meeting her," Elinor said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it. After the heavy silence of the night before, the promise of another voice in this quiet house felt almost like relief. The Duke nodded, and for just a moment, something close to a smile touched the corner of his mouth before fading away again. It was not much, but it was something. And as Elinor sat there in the pale morning light, 3 days away from becoming his wife, she found herself wondering how many more small moments like this one might be waiting, hidden beneath all that careful, guarded silence. The glass shattered against the stone floor, before Elinor even realized her hand had let go of it. 3 weeks had passed since her wedding day, and the sound of breaking porcelain seemed to echo through the entire east wing of Ashfield Manor. She stood frozen for a moment, staring at the shards scattered across the floor, her heart pounding from the argument that had just ended, if it could even be called an argument. The Duke had simply walked away mid-sentence, as he always did, leaving her words hanging useless in the empty air. "Miss, your grace," Margaret corrected herself gently, appearing in the doorway with a broom already in hand, as though she had anticipated the mess before it happened. "Let me clean that for you." "I can do it myself," Elinor said, though her voice cracked slightly, betraying the frustration she was trying to hide. Margaret paused, studying her with the kind of quiet understanding that came from years of watching this house and the people within it. "It is not my place to say, my lady, but the Duke is not an easy man to know. He was not always so quiet." Elinor looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" But Margaret only shook her head, busying herself with sweeping the broken glass into a neat pile. "That is a story for another day, my lady. Best not to keep dwelling on things that cannot be changed by wishing." Elinor let the matter drop, though the words stayed with her long after Margaret had gone. Not always so quiet. She thought of those words often over the following days, turning them over like a puzzle piece she could not yet fit into place. Life at Ashfield Manor had settled into a strange, careful rhythm since the wedding. Elinor rose early, breakfasted alone more often than not, and spent her mornings wandering the vast gardens or reading in the small library tucked away on the ground floor. The Duke kept to his study for most of the day, emerging only for dinner, where their conversations remained polite but distant, like two diplomats negotiating a fragile peace neither fully understood. She had tried in those first weeks to bridge the distance between them. She had asked him about his childhood, his interests, the history of the manor itself. He answered when pressed, but never more than what was asked, never offering anything freely. It was like trying to draw water from a well that had been sealed shut long ago. Tonight's argument, if it deserved the name, had begun over something so small Elinor almost laughed thinking about it now. She had suggested rearranging the flowers in the entrance hall, brightening the space with color instead of the same dark arrangements that had stood there for what looked like years. The Duke had simply said, "Leave them as they are," in a tone so final it left no room for discussion. Why, she had asked, more out of curiosity than defiance. They would look lovely with some color. "Leave them," he repeated, and something in his voice had made her push further, some stubborn part of her refusing to accept another closed door in this house full of them. "Is there a reason, Your Grace, or is this simply another rule I am meant to follow without question?" His jaw had tightened, and for a moment she thought he might actually answer her, might finally offer some piece of himself beyond the careful mask he wore every day. Instead, he had turned and walked from the room without another word, leaving Alina standing there with her question unanswered and her patience finally breaking. Now alone in the hallway with broken glass at her feet, Alina felt something shift inside her, a hardening resolve she had not expected to find so soon into this marriage. She had come here willing to try, willing to build something out of an arrangement neither of them had chosen freely. But she would not spend the rest of her life tiptoeing around a man who refused to let her in even an inch. She found him later that evening in the study, exactly where she expected, seated behind a large desk covered in papers he did not appear to be reading. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression shifted, though she could not name what it was. "I did not mean to upset you," he said before she could speak, surprising her with the admission. "Then why will you not simply talk to me?" Alina asked, closing the door behind her so the servants would not overhear. "I am your wife now, Your Grace. Whatever this marriage is, whatever it was meant to be, I cannot live inside a house full of silence and locked doors." He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tapping absently against the edge of the desk. "The flowers," he said finally. "They were arranged the same way the day my mother died. No one has changed them since." Alina's anger drained away as quickly as it had risen, replaced by something softer, something that ached in her chest. "Edward," she said, using his given name for the first time since their wedding, "I am sorry. I did not know." "There was no reason for you to know," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier coldness. "I have not spoken of it to anyone in years." "Perhaps that is the trouble," Alina said gently, moving closer to his desk. "You carry all of it alone, as though sharing even a small piece of it would break something. But you do not have to carry it alone anymore. That is what a marriage is meant to be, is it not? Two people carrying things together that neither could manage alone." He looked up at her then, really looked at her, in a way he had not since that first evening in the drawing room. "You speak as though you understand something about marriage that I have long since stopped believing in." "Perhaps I only understand what I hope it could be," Alina admitted. "I am not foolish enough to think love comes easily between strangers, but respect, honesty, even simple kindness, those things can grow if we allow them to." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and outside, Alina could hear the faint sound of wind moving through the trees. Finally, the Duke set down his pen and rose from his chair, crossing the room until he stood before her. "My mother died when I was 12 years old," he said quietly. "She loved flowers more than anything else in this house. After she passed, my father could not bear to have anyone touch the arrangements she had left behind. By the time I inherited this house, it had simply become habit, a way of keeping something of her alive, I suppose, even in something as small as a vase of flowers no one has replaced in years." Alina felt something tighten in her throat. "That is not foolish, Edward, that is love. Grief and love, tangled together in a way that makes it hard to separate one from the other." He studied her for a long moment, and something in his careful, guarded expression seemed to loosen, just slightly, like a knot beginning to come undone. "You are the first person who has said that to me without either pitying me or telling me to simply move forward." "I do not think grief works that way," Alina said softly. "I think it stays with us quietly in small corners of our lives, and we learn to live alongside it rather than pretending it does not exist." "You speak from experience," he observed. "My mother died 3 years ago," Alina said. I still keep her favorite shawl folded at the bottom of my trunk. I have never worn it. I do not think I ever will. But I cannot bear to leave it behind either. Something passed between them then, some quiet understanding neither of them had expected to find in each other. Two strangers bound together by circumstance who had just discovered, quite by accident, a shared and tender wound. The Duke reached out, hesitating only slightly, and took her hand in his. "Thank you," he said simply, "for asking." It was such a small thing, that touch of his hand against hers, and yet Alina felt it settle something restless inside her chest. Perhaps this marriage would never be the love story she had once dreamed of as a girl. But perhaps, she thought, watching the firelight flicker across his face, it could become something real nonetheless, built slowly, patiently, out of small moments like this one. Over the following weeks, small changes began to appear throughout Ashfield Manor, so gradual that Alina almost did not notice them at first. The Duke began joining her for breakfast rather than taking it alone in his study. Their evening conversations grew longer, less careful, occasionally even drifting into laughter, a sound Alina quickly realized she had never heard from him before that night in the study. He told her slowly, in pieces offered over quiet evenings, about his childhood at Ashfield, about a father who had grown distant and cold after his wife's death, about a sister, Charlotte, who had been the only warmth left in the house during those difficult years. Alina found herself sharing pieces of her own life in return, stories of her mother's laughter, her father's slow decline into debt and desperation, the fear that had followed her through every year since her mother's passing. They were not yet friends, not truly, not in the way Alina hoped they might one day become. But something had shifted between them that night in the study, some fragile beginning neither of them dared name too soon, for fear of breaking whatever delicate thing was just starting to grow. One afternoon, nearly a month after the wedding, Alina found herself in the entrance hall, standing before the old, faded flower arrangement that had started everything. She studied it for a long moment, the dried petals, the dust that had settled across the vase's edges. And then, carefully, she added a single fresh flower to the arrangement, tucking it gently among the old ones rather than replacing them entirely. When the Duke passed through the hall later that evening and noticed the addition, he stopped, staring at it for a long moment. Alina watched from the staircase, holding her breath, uncertain how he would react. "I did not remove anything," she said quietly, coming down the stairs to stand beside him. "I only thought, perhaps something new could exist alongside what came before, not replacing it. Simply growing beside it." He reached out and touched one of the old, dried petals gently, then turned to look at her, and for the first time since her arrival at Ashfield Manor, Alina saw something unguarded in his expression, something that looked almost like hope. "My mother would have liked you," he said quietly. "She always believed old things and new things could exist together if given enough patience." "Then perhaps we shall have to be patient," Alina said, offering him a small smile. "Perhaps," he agreed, and for the briefest moment his hand found hers again, warm and steady in the quiet hallway, two strangers slowly, carefully, learning how to become something else entirely. But even as that fragile warmth grew between them, Alina could not shake the sense that something else lingered beneath the surface of this house, some deeper history that Margaret's careful silence and the Duke's guarded eyes had not yet revealed. She thought again of the housekeeper's words. He was not always so quiet. There was more to learn here, she realized, more shadows hiding in the corners of this beautiful, sorrowful house. And though she did not know it yet, standing there in the golden evening light with her husband's hand in hers, the deepest test of their fragile new bond was still waiting, just beyond the horizon, closer than either of them could have imagined. Charlotte visited often during those weeks, her bright laughter filling rooms that had grown too used to silence. She was nothing like her brother, quick with her words, generous with her opinions, and utterly delighted by the change she noticed in him each time she called. "I have not seen him smile this much in years," Charlotte confided one afternoon, as she and Alina walked together through the gardens, their arms linked against the cool autumn air. "You must forgive me for staring at you so. I keep waiting to see what magic you have worked on him." "No magic," Elinor said, laughing softly. "Only patience and perhaps a little stubbornness." "Stubbornness is exactly what my brother needs," Charlotte said. "He has spent so many years convincing himself that keeping people at a distance was a kindness, as though loving someone only meant losing them eventually. Our mother's death changed him in ways I do not think he has ever fully admitted, even to himself." Elinor considered this as they walked, thinking of the flowers in the entrance hall, the careful way the Duke guarded even the smallest pieces of his heart. "He is trying," she said finally. "I believe that counts for something." "It counts for a great deal," Charlotte agreed, squeezing her arm gently. "More than you know." That evening, Elinor found herself smiling as she prepared for dinner, humming softly to herself for the first time since arriving at Ashfield. The house no longer felt quite so much like a stranger's home. Slowly, carefully, it was beginning to feel like something closer to her own. She caught her reflection in the mirror before heading downstairs and paused, studying the woman looking back at her. There was color in her cheeks now that had not been there on her wedding day, a steadiness in her eyes that had replaced the fear she once carried into this house. Whatever waited ahead, whatever shadows still lingered in the corners of Ashfield Manor, Elinor felt, for the first time, that she was no longer facing them entirely alone. The horse reared without warning, and Elinor felt the world tip sideways before she even understood what was happening. She had gone riding alone that morning, something she had done countless times since childhood, comfortable enough in the saddle that she rarely thought twice about the danger of it. The autumn air had been crisp and clear, perfect for a ride along the eastern edge of the Ashfield estate, where the fields opened wide beneath a pale morning sky. She had not expected the sudden flash of a hare darting across the path, nor the way her horse startled so violently beneath her. The fall happened fast, faster than thought, faster than fear. One moment she was upright, reins tight in her hands, and the next she was on the ground, pain exploding through her side as the impact knocked the breath from her lungs. She lay there for a long moment, staring up at the gray sky, unable to move, unable to even call out. It was a farmhand from a neighboring field who found her nearly 20 minutes later, alerted by her riderless horse wandering back toward the manor alone. By the time they carried her inside, Elinor had drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain in her side sharpening with every jolt of movement. The Duke's face was the first clear thing she remembered when she finally woke, pale and drawn, hovering above her with an expression of such raw fear that Elinor almost did not recognize him. Gone was the careful, guarded distance he wore like armor. In its place was something naked and desperate, something that frightened her more than the pain radiating through her ribs. "Elinor," he said, his voice cracking on her name. Thank God you are awake." "What happened?" she managed to ask, though the words came out weak and broken. "You fell," he said. "The horse threw you. The physician says you have broken 2 ribs, and there is a wound on your leg that required stitching. You lost a great deal of blood before they found you." Elinor tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, pain lancing through her side so sharply that she gasped and fell back against the pillows. The Duke was at her side instantly, his hand pressed gently against her shoulder, holding her still. "Do not move," he said, "please. The physician said you must rest completely for at least a fortnight, perhaps longer." "A fortnight," Elinor repeated, dismay creeping into her voice. She had never been one for stillness, for lying idle in bed while the world continued on without her. "It could have been so much worse," the Duke said, and Elinor noticed then how his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the blanket around her. "When they told me you had fallen when I saw you lying there so still." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, his jaw tightening against whatever emotion threatened to break through. "I am here," Elinor said softly, reaching for his hand despite the effort it cost her. "I am still here, Edward." He held her hand tightly, as though afraid to let go, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Elinor watched the firelight flicker across his face, noting the exhaustion in his eyes, the days of worry etched into features that had grown steadily less guarded over the weeks since their wedding. "How long have you been sitting here?" she asked eventually. Since they brought you in, he admitted. 3 days now. 3 days, Alina echoed, stunned. Edward, you must rest. You cannot simply sit at my bedside without sleep. I could not leave, he said simply. I did not want you to wake alone. The weeks that followed tested Alina's patience in ways she had not anticipated. The physician's orders were strict, and even the smallest movement sent sharp pain through her ribs, forcing her to rely on others for even the simplest tasks. She, who had always prized her independence, found herself needing help to sit up, to eat, to change positions in bed without aggravating her injuries further. It was humbling, and more than once during those long, aching days, Alina found herself close to tears from frustration alone, quite apart from the physical pain itself. The wound on her leg throbbed constantly, a deep, persistent ache that made even sleep difficult, and the broken ribs made every breath feel like a small battle. The Duke, to Alina's continued surprise, remained a steady presence throughout her recovery. He read to her in the afternoons when the pain kept her from focusing on the pages herself. He sat with her during the worst of the nights, when the ache in her side grew sharp enough to keep her awake, offering quiet conversation to distract her from the discomfort. He learned, through careful observation, exactly how she liked her tea, exactly which pillows eased the pressure on her ribs, exactly when she needed silence, and when she needed distraction. You do not have to do all this, Alina told him one evening, nearly 2 weeks into her recovery, as he carefully helped her adjust the bandages on her leg with hands far more gentle than she would have expected from a man of his stature. I know I do not have to, he said, not looking up from his task. I want to. Why? The question slipped out before she could stop it, born from exhaustion and pain, and a lingering disbelief that anyone, let alone the careful, distant man she had married, could care for her so completely. He paused, finally looking up to meet her eyes. Because when I thought I might lose you, Alina, I realized how much I had already come to depend on you being here, not as a duty, not as an arrangement, but simply as yourself. The house feels different with you in it, warmer somehow. I do not wish to imagine it without you. Alina felt tears prick at her eyes, though whether from the pain or his words, she could not entirely say. That sounds dangerously close to affection, Your Grace. Perhaps it is, he admitted, a small rare smile touching his lips. I confess I am somewhat out of practice at recognizing the feeling. Despite the pain, despite the frustration of her forced stillness, those weeks of recovery became, in their own strange way, some of the most tender of Alina's new life at Ashfield Manor. Stripped of pretense, forced into vulnerability she could not hide behind careful words or polite distance, she found herself truly seen by her husband for the first time, and in turn, she began to see him more clearly as well. There were setbacks, of course. One evening, nearly 3 weeks into her recovery, the wound on her leg became inflamed, heat radiating from the injury with an intensity that frightened them both. The physician was called back urgently, and Alina endured a painful cleaning of the wound that left her shaking and pale by the time it was finished. It aches terribly, she admitted afterward, once the physician had gone and the Duke sat beside her bed once more, his face still tight with worry. I do not know if I can bear another treatment like that. You will not have to face it alone, he said firmly. Whatever comes, Alina, I will be here. She studied him for a long moment, this man who had once seemed so distant and unreachable, now sitting beside her with such quiet devotion that it nearly broke something open in her chest. Edward, she said softly, thank you for staying. Always, he said, and though the word was simple, Alina heard in it a promise far deeper than the circumstances of their marriage had ever demanded of him. Slowly, painfully, her body began to heal. The bruising faded. The wound on her leg closed properly this time, leaving behind only a thin scar as evidence of how close disaster had come. Her ribs, though still tender, allowed her to sit up without gasping, to take deeper breaths without wincing, to imagine, finally, a day when she might walk through the gardens again without fear of collapsing halfway through. Throughout it all, the Duke remained steady, patient, present in ways Alina had never expected from the cold, guarded man she had married. And as her body healed, something else healed alongside it, some deeper wound within their marriage itself, mended not through grand gestures but through countless small acts of care, repeated day after day, until trust had quietly, carefully taken root between them. One afternoon, nearly a month after the accident, Alina finally felt strong enough to walk to the window unassisted, watching the golden autumn light spill across the gardens below. The Duke found her there, standing on her own 2 feet for the first time in weeks, and something in his expression, relief mixed with pride, mixed with something that looked remarkably like love, made Alina's heart ache in an entirely different way than the injuries that had plagued her for so long. "Look at you," he said softly, crossing the room to stand beside her. "I told you I would recover," Alina said, though her voice trembled slightly with the effort of standing so long. "You did," he agreed, slipping an arm gently around her waist to steady her. "Though I confess these past weeks have taught me more about fear than I ever wished to learn." "And what have you learned?" Alina asked, leaning into his support without hesitation, a gesture that would have felt impossible only weeks before. "That losing you would break something in me I do not think could ever be repaired," he said quietly. "I did not expect to feel this deeply, Alina, not this soon. Perhaps not ever, if I am honest about the walls I built after my mother's death." "And yet here you are," Alina said, turning to look at him fully. "Walls and all, sitting beside my bed for 3 days straight, learning how I take my tea." A genuine laugh escaped him then, warm and unguarded, a sound Alina realized she had come to treasure more than almost anything else in this quiet, once sorrowful house. "Yes," he admitted. "Here I am." Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, scattering golden leaves across the garden paths below, and Alina found herself thinking, not for the first time, that perhaps this marriage, born from necessity and arrangement rather than choice, might yet become something far greater than either of them had dared to imagine on that first rainy evening when she arrived as a stranger at his door. But even as hope bloomed quietly between them, Alina could not shake a small, persistent unease. Margaret's old words returned to her sometimes, in quiet moments like these. He was not always so quiet. There was still a story here she did not fully understand, a history buried somewhere beneath the surface of this healing, fragile love. And though she pushed the thought aside for now, content simply to stand there in her husband's arms, watching the light fade gently across the gardens, she knew, somewhere deep within her, that the truth would not stay hidden forever. Charlotte visited nearly every day during Alina's recovery, arriving with baskets of fruit, small bundles of wildflowers gathered from her own garden, and a stream of cheerful conversation that never seemed to run dry. She would sit at the foot of the bed, chattering about news from the village, about a new bonnet she had ordered from town, about anything at all that might lift Alina's spirits during the long, aching afternoons. "You should have seen my brother the day they carried you in," Charlotte confided one afternoon, lowering her voice as though sharing a great secret. "I have never seen him so pale. He would not leave your side even to eat until Margaret practically forced a tray upon him." "He has been very attentive," Alina admitted, a small smile tugging at her lips despite the persistent ache in her ribs. "Attentive," Charlotte repeated, laughing softly. "Alina, my brother has not shown this much feeling toward anyone since our mother passed. You must understand what a remarkable thing that is. I had begun to fear he would spend his whole life locked away behind those careful walls of his, polite and distant, and entirely alone." Alina considered this, thinking of the countless small kindnesses he had shown her throughout her recovery, the patience, the quiet devotion that had slowly worn away at her own doubts about their marriage. "I do not think he is as locked away as you fear, Charlotte. Perhaps he simply needed someone willing to wait long enough to see past the walls." "Perhaps," Charlotte agreed, though something in her expression grew momentarily thoughtful, almost hesitant, as though she considered saying more before deciding against it. "What is it?" Alina asked, noticing the shift. "Nothing," Charlotte said a touch too quickly. "Only old memories. This house holds a great many of them, some happier than others. Alina wanted to press further, curiosity mingling with the same unease Margaret's earlier words had planted in her mind. But exhaustion pulled at her before she could find the right question to ask. And Charlotte, ever perceptive, gently changed the subject to lighter matters, leaving whatever memory had surfaced unspoken between them. The physician, a kind but no-nonsense man named Dr. Whitfield, visited every few days to check on Alina's progress, and it was during one such visit that Alina finally understood the full extent of how close she had come to real danger. "You lost a significant amount of blood, my lady," Dr. Whitfield explained, examining the now-healing wound on her leg with careful, practiced hands. "Had the farmhand not found you when he did, I fear the outcome might have been far more serious. The Duke was quite beside himself when I arrived that first day. I have rarely seen a man so shaken." "I did not realize it had been so severe," Alina admitted quietly. "These things rarely feel as severe to the one who suffers them as they do to those who witness it," Dr. Whitfield said, offering her a kind smile as he finished rebandaging her leg. "You are healing remarkably well, all things considered. Continue resting as instructed, and I expect a full recovery within another few weeks." That evening, once the physician had gone and Charlotte had returned home, Alina found herself alone with her thoughts for the first time in days, the quiet of the room pressing in around her as she considered how fragile life truly was, how quickly everything could change in the space of a single startled moment on a quiet morning ride. She thought of her mother, gone so suddenly from illness 3 years before, and of how differently her own accident might have ended had fortune not favored her that day. She thought, too, of the Duke's face when he had first appeared at her bedside, pale and desperate in a way she had never imagined the careful, guarded man capable of showing. When he came to check on her later that night, finding her still awake despite the late hour, he immediately noticed the troubled look on her face. "What is it?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her bed that had become almost permanently his over the past weeks. "Are you in pain?" "No," Alina said, shaking her head slowly. "I was only thinking about how close I came to leaving you far sooner than either of us expected." His expression tightened, the careful composure he had slowly begun rebuilding over recent days cracking slightly at her words. "Please do not speak of it so plainly. I have spent enough nights imagining that outcome without needing to hear it spoken aloud." "I am sorry," Alina said softly, reaching for his hand. "I did not mean to frighten you further. I only wished you to know how grateful I am for everything you have done these past weeks. I do not think I fully understood, before this accident, how deeply you had already come to care." "Nor did I," he admitted, his fingers tightening gently around hers. "I have spent so many years convincing myself that keeping people at arm's length was the safer path, the wiser choice. But sitting beside your bed these past weeks, watching you fight through pain I could do nothing to ease, I realized how foolish that belief truly was. Distance protects nothing, Alina. It only delays the inevitable ache of caring for someone, while robbing you of the joy that could have come alongside it." Alina felt her throat tighten with emotion at his words, so unlike the careful, guarded man she had first met on her wedding day. "Then let us not choose distance any longer," she said quietly. "Whatever comes, Edward, let us face it together openly, without walls between us." "Together," he agreed, lifting her hand gently to press a soft kiss against her knuckles, a small gesture that nonetheless carried the weight of everything unspoken between them. As the weeks of recovery continued, that promise of togetherness became the quiet foundation upon which their marriage steadily grew stronger. Alina watched, with growing wonder, as the Duke slowly shed more and more of the careful armor he had worn for so many years, revealing beneath it a man capable of deep feeling, quiet humor, and a tenderness she suspected few others had ever been permitted to witness. By the time Dr. Whitfield finally pronounced her fully healed, nearly 6 weeks after the accident, Alina felt as though she had emerged from the ordeal not merely recovered in body, but transformed in her understanding of the man she had married. The distant, guarded Duke of her wedding day had become someone else entirely, someone whose quiet devotion had carried her through the darkest weeks of pain and uncertainty, someone she had, quite unexpectedly, begun to genuinely love. Yet even as their bond deepened, Alina remained aware of the shadows Charlotte's hesitant pause had hinted at, the unspoken history that seemed to linger just beneath the surface of this healing household. She did not yet know what secrets Ashfield Manor still held, what old memories had caused Charlotte's expression to falter so briefly that afternoon. But she sensed, with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned to read the subtle language of this careful, guarded family, that those secrets would not remain hidden for very much longer. A letter arrived one morning that changed the quiet rhythm of Ashfield Manor entirely. Alina noticed it first, a cream envelope sealed with unfamiliar wax, sitting among the usual correspondence on the breakfast table. She thought nothing of it until she saw the Duke's face as he opened it, watching the color drain slowly from his cheeks as his eyes moved across the page. "Edward," she said, alarmed by the sudden change in him, "what is it?" He did not answer immediately, folding the letter with hands that trembled slightly before setting it aside. "It is nothing that concerns you," he said, though his voice lacked its usual steadiness. "Edward," Alina pressed gently, "we agreed there would be no more walls between us. Please, tell me what has upset you so." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the folded letter as though it were something dangerous, something that might bite if handled carelessly. "It is from Lord Pemberton," he said finally, "an old family friend. He writes to inform me that Isabel has returned to England." The name meant nothing to Alina, and yet the way he spoke it, careful and heavy, told her it carried significant weight. Who is Isabel? The Duke's jaw tightened, and for a moment Alina feared he might retreat back into the guarded silence she had worked so hard these past months to dismantle. But he did not. Instead, he took a slow breath and met her eyes directly. "Isabel was to be my wife," he said quietly. "Before you, before any of this. We were engaged for nearly 2 years until she left England rather suddenly without explanation 5 years ago." Alina felt something cold settle in her stomach, though she could not entirely name the feeling. Jealousy, perhaps, or simply the unsettling realization that there remained pieces of her husband's past she had not yet uncovered. "You never mentioned her." "There seemed little reason to," he said. "It ended long before I ever met you. I did not think it relevant to our marriage." "And now," Alina asked carefully, "is it relevant now?" He hesitated, and that hesitation told her more than any words could have. "I do not know," he admitted. "I have not seen her in 5 years, Alina. I do not know what she wants, returning now after all this time." That evening, Alina sought out Charlotte, hoping the Duke's sister might finally share whatever piece of history had caused her such hesitation weeks earlier, during Alina's recovery. She found her in the small parlor Charlotte favored during her visits, and before Alina could even ask her question directly, Charlotte set down her needlework with a resigned sigh. "You have heard about Isabel, then," Charlotte said, reading the question in Alina's expression before it was even spoken. "He mentioned her briefly," Alina said, settling into the chair across from her. "But I sense there is more to the story than he has shared." Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words with obvious care. "Isabel Pemberton was, for a time, everything my brother wanted in a wife. Beautiful, clever, from an excellent family. They were engaged when he was 23, deeply in love, or so it seemed to everyone around them. I have never seen Edward happier than he was during those 2 years." "What happened?" Alina asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. "She left," Charlotte said simply. 2 weeks before their wedding, she simply vanished, left only a brief letter explaining she could not go through with the marriage, and departed for the continent with barely any warning. Edward never received a proper explanation, not then, not in all the years since. He simply woke one morning to find the woman he loved gone, with nothing but a few cold sentences to explain 5 years of devotion. Alina felt her heart ache at the thought of it. The young man Edward must have been, full of hope and love, only to have it shattered so suddenly and completely. That must have devastated him. It nearly broke him, Charlotte said quietly. He did not leave his rooms for nearly a month afterward. When he finally emerged, he was different, harder, more guarded than I had ever seen him. He swore he would never again allow himself to love so openly, so completely, only to be abandoned without explanation. I believe that is precisely why he agreed so readily to marry you, Alina. An arranged marriage carried no risk of that particular heartbreak. There was no love to lose, or so he believed at the time. Alina sat with this new understanding for a long moment, pieces of the Duke's careful distance finally clicking into place. The guarded eyes, the reluctance to speak of feeling, the walls he had built so carefully around his heart, all of it now made a painful sort of sense. And now she has returned. Now she has returned, Charlotte confirmed, her expression troubled. I do not know what she wants, Alina, or why she has chosen to come back after all this time, but I fear it will not be easy for my brother, seeing her again after everything that happened between them. That night, Alina lay awake long after the Duke had retired to his own chambers, turning Charlotte's words over in her mind. She thought of the fragile trust they had built together over these past months, the tender devotion he had shown during her recovery, the careful, patient way he had begun opening his heart to her despite years of guarding it so fiercely. Would Isabel's return threaten all of that? Would old wounds, reopened by her sudden reappearance, undo the progress they had made together? She did not have long to wonder. 3 days later, a formal invitation arrived from Lord Pemberton, requesting the Duke and Duchess of Ashfield attend a gathering at his estate, welcoming his daughter back to English society after her years abroad. The Duke's hands shook slightly as he read the invitation, and Alina watched him carefully, searching his expression for some hint of what he truly felt. "We do not have to attend," Alina offered gently, though part of her desperately wanted to understand this piece of his past, to see with her own eyes the woman who had once held his heart so completely. "We should attend," he said finally, though his voice carried little enthusiasm. Refusing would only invite gossip and speculation. Better to face it directly than allow rumors to fill the silence. The evening of the gathering arrived far too quickly for Alina's liking. She dressed carefully, choosing a deep green gown that Charlotte had once complimented, and tried to steady the nervous flutter in her stomach as their carriage approached the Pemberton estate. Beside her, the Duke sat rigid and silent, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the carriage window. "Edward," Alina said softly, reaching for his hand, "whatever happens tonight, remember that you are not that same young man anymore. Whatever she left behind 5 years ago, you have built something new since then, something real." He turned to look at her, something grateful and vulnerable flickering across his features. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I do not know what I would do without you beside me tonight." The gathering was crowded and bright, filled with the kind of polite chatter and careful social maneuvering Alina had grown accustomed to since her marriage. She spotted Isabel almost immediately, a striking woman with dark hair and confident bearing, surrounded by a small cluster of admirers near the center of the room. When Isabel's eyes finally landed on the Duke, something complicated passed across her expression, surprise mixed with something that might have been regret. "Edward," Isabel said, approaching them with a poise that seemed almost practiced, as though she had rehearsed this exact moment many times during her years abroad. "It has been a long time." "Isabel," he replied, his voice carefully controlled, though Alina could feel the tension radiating from him even through the light grip of his hand on her arm. "You look well. This is my wife, Alina, Duchess of Ashfield." Isabel's eyes shifted to Alina, studying her with an intensity that felt almost uncomfortable. "Your wife," she repeated softly. "I had not heard you married." "It happened rather quickly," Alina said, choosing her words carefully, unwilling to let this stranger's presence unsettle her composure. "I understand you have only recently returned to England." "Yes," Isabel said, her gaze flickering briefly back to the Duke before settling once more on Alina. "Circumstances abroad became complicated. I felt it was time to return home." The conversation remained stiff and careful throughout the evening, though Alina noticed the way Isabel's eyes returned repeatedly to the Duke throughout the gathering, searching his expression for something Alina could not entirely name. It was only much later in the evening, when Alina found herself briefly alone near the refreshment table, that Isabel approached her directly, her earlier composure slipping slightly to reveal something more genuine beneath. "You must think me terribly cruel," Isabel said quietly, "leaving him the way I did." Alina studied her carefully before answering. "I think there must have been reasons I do not fully understand." Isabel's expression softened with something like gratitude at Alina's measured response. "My father arranged a match for me abroad, one I could not refuse without bringing ruin upon my family. I loved Edward deeply, more than I have loved anyone since, but I had no choice in the matter. I could not bear to face him and explain such a painful truth, so I fled instead, like a coward, leaving him to believe I simply did not care enough to stay." "Why tell me this now?" Alina asked. "Because I see the way he looks at you," Isabel said softly. "It is different than how he ever looked at me, softer somehow, more open. I do not wish to cause trouble between you. I only wanted him to know, eventually, that I never stopped caring, even if circumstances forced my hand all those years ago." Alina considered her words carefully, feeling the weight of this revelation settle heavily in her chest. "Perhaps you should tell him yourself," she said finally. "He has carried this wound for 5 years, believing you simply abandoned him without cause. He deserves to know the truth, whatever it may mean for either of you now." Later that night, once they had returned to Ashfield Manor, Alina relayed Isabel's confession to the Duke, watching carefully as a complicated mixture of relief and lingering grief crossed his features. "All these years," he said quietly, "I believed she simply stopped loving me. I built so many walls around my heart because of that belief." "And now you know differently," Alina said gently. "Does it change anything between us, Edward?" He turned to look at her then, something fierce and certain replacing the earlier vulnerability in his expression. "It changes how I understand my past," he said. "But it changes nothing about my feelings for you, Alina. If anything, understanding Isabel's truth only makes me more grateful for what we have built together, slowly, honestly, without secrets between us." Alina felt relief wash through her at his words, though a small, persistent thought lingered in the back of her mind. Old wounds, once reopened, rarely closed so simply or so completely. Whatever peace Edward had found tonight regarding his past with Isabel, Alina sensed that this was not quite the end of the story, but merely the closing of one chapter before another, more challenging one began. In the days that followed, Alina watched something settle more firmly into place between herself and Edward, a quiet confidence that had not existed before Isabel's return forced old truths into the light. He seemed lighter somehow, freed from a burden of misunderstanding he had carried silently for 5 long years, and that freedom seemed to open him further still, allowing warmth and laughter into moments that had once been guarded by careful reserve. "I owe you a great deal," he told her one evening, as they sat together before the fire in the drawing room, the same room where she had first arrived as a frightened stranger months earlier. "You did not have to encourage that conversation with Isabel. You could have let old wounds remain buried, kept me from ever learning the truth." "I did not want a shadow between us," Alina said simply. "Even a shadow from your past. I would rather face difficult truths together than allow uncertainty to fester unspoken." "You are wiser than your years," he said, reaching for her hand across the small space between their chairs. "I find myself endlessly grateful that circumstance brought you into this house, into this life, whatever arrangement first placed us together." Alina smiled softly, though a quiet unease still lingered somewhere beneath her contentment, a persistent sense that their story was far from finished, that greater tests of their fragile, growing love still waited somewhere in the months ahead. But for now, in the warm glow of the fire, with her husband's hand steady in hers, she allowed herself simply to enjoy this hard-won peace, however temporary it might yet prove to be. Winter settled over Ashfield Manor with a quiet, steady grace, blanketing the gardens in soft white snow and filling the long halls with the comforting scent of wood smoke and cinnamon. Elinor found herself, in those cold months, discovering a happiness she had never expected to find within these walls, a warmth that grew steadily between herself and Edward with each passing week. They had settled into a rhythm together now, one built not on the careful distance of their early marriage but on genuine companionship. Mornings often found them sharing breakfast together, discussing plans for the estate, or simply enjoying comfortable silence over cups of tea. Evenings brought quiet conversations by the fire, sometimes stretching late into the night as they shared stories from their pasts, hopes for their future, small dreams neither had dared voice to anyone before. "Tell me something you have never told anyone," Elinor said one snowy evening, curled beside him on the settee, a blanket draped over both their laps against the winter chill. Edward considered the request for a long moment, his fingers absently tracing patterns against her hand. "When I was young, before my mother died, I wanted to become a physician rather than inherit this title. I used to sneak into the village and watch the local doctor treat patients, fascinated by how he could ease suffering with knowledge and careful hands." "What happened to that dream?" Elinor asked, genuinely surprised by this glimpse into a version of him she had never imagined. "My father made it quite clear such a path was beneath a future duke," Edward said, a hint of old bitterness coloring his voice. "After my mother passed, there seemed even less room for such foolish dreams. Duty demanded I focus entirely on preparing for the responsibilities I would eventually inherit." "That seems a great loss," Elinor said softly. "You clearly still carry that compassion within you. I have seen it in how carefully you cared for me during my recovery, how patiently you tend to matters concerning the tenants on this estate." "Perhaps some dreams simply find other ways to live within us," Edward said, "even when circumstance forces us away from their original path." Elinor shared pieces of her own hidden history in return, confessing a childhood fascination with painting that her father had dismissed as impractical once his debts began mounting, forcing every resource toward more pressing concerns. "I used to imagine myself traveling to Italy one day, studying the great masters, filling canvases with color rather than worrying over household accounts and social obligations." "Perhaps you still could," Edward suggested. "We are not so bound by circumstance now as we once were, Elinor. If painting brings you joy, there is no reason you should not pursue it, even now." The suggestion surprised her, warmth blooming in her chest at the genuine encouragement in his voice. "You would not think it a foolish indulgence." "I think joy is rarely foolish," Edward said, "whatever form it takes. I have spent too many years believing duty and happiness existed in separate, incompatible spheres. I no longer believe that to be true." Encouraged by his words, Elinor began spending her afternoons in the small conservatory attached to the eastern wing, filling canvas after canvas with images of the gardens, the winter landscape beyond the manor's walls, even, occasionally, careful studies of Edward himself, caught unaware in quiet moments of reading or thought. He never seemed to mind the attention, often teasing her gently about capturing his likeness so thoroughly, though Elinor noticed the quiet pride in his expression whenever he glimpsed her latest work. Their growing intimacy extended beyond mere conversation and shared interests, deepening into a physical closeness that had developed slowly, naturally, born from genuine trust rather than obligation. Elinor found herself looking forward to the quiet moments they shared each evening, the gentle way he would draw her close before the fire, the tender warmth of his embrace as they retired together each night, no longer strangers sharing a house out of necessity, but true partners building a genuine life together. Yet even amid this growing happiness, small moments occasionally reminded Elinor that old wounds, though healing, had not entirely disappeared. One evening, a letter arrived from Isabel, addressed formally to both Edward and Elinor, expressing gratitude for their kindness at the Pemberton gathering and extending an invitation for tea should they ever find themselves in London. Edward read the letter with careful neutrality, though Elinor noticed the slight tension in his shoulders as he set it aside. "Does it trouble you?" Elinor asked gently, hearing from her. "Not in the way it once might have," Edward admitted. I find I have made a strange kind of peace with that chapter of my life, though I confess there remains a small part of me that wonders what might have been, had circumstances been different all those years ago. Elinor felt a flicker of old insecurity at his words, though she quickly reminded herself of everything they had built together since that difficult evening at Isabel's gathering. That is only natural, I think. We cannot simply erase our past, however much we might wish it sometimes. No, Edward agreed, reaching for her hand. But I find I have no desire to trade my present for any version of that past, Elinor. Whatever might have been with Isabel, I do not believe it could have grown into anything as genuine, as deeply rooted, as what has grown between us. His words settled the small unease in her heart, and Elinor found herself smiling softly as she leaned into his embrace, grateful for the quiet honesty that had come to define their marriage. This was what Charlotte had meant, she realized, watching the firelight dance across Edward's face as he held her close. Not a love born from grand romantic gestures or dramatic declarations, but something steadier, something built patiently over countless small moments of trust and vulnerability, until it had become the very foundation of their shared life together. As winter deepened around Ashfield Manor, Elinor found herself reflecting often on how far they had traveled together since that first rainy evening when she arrived as a frightened stranger at his door. The careful, guarded Duke she had married had become someone else entirely, someone capable of deep tenderness, genuine laughter, and quiet devotion she treasured more with each passing day. One particularly cold evening, as snow fell steadily outside the drawing-room windows, Edward surprised her with a small, carefully wrapped package after dinner. Inside, Elinor found a set of fine painting supplies, brushes and pigments of a quality she had never owned before, along with a note written in his careful hand. "For the dreams we set aside too long," it read. "May this bring you the joy it should have brought years ago." "Edward," Elinor said, tears pricking at her eyes as she studied the thoughtful gift, "this is far too generous." "Nonsense," he said, though his expression softened at her emotional response. "You have given me back pieces of myself I thought lost forever, Elinor." Warmth, laughter, the capacity to trust again after years of guarding myself against exactly this kind of vulnerability. The least I can offer in return is encouragement toward your own forgotten dreams. She set the gift aside carefully and moved to embrace him fully, feeling his arms wrap securely around her in response, a gesture that had become so natural between them now that Elinor could hardly remember the careful distance that once defined their early days together. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder, "for all of it, for this house becoming a true home. For teaching me that trust, once broken by circumstance, can still be rebuilt into something even stronger than before." "Thank you," he replied softly, "for having the patience to wait long enough to see past my walls, Elinor. I do not think I could have found my way back to myself without you." They remained there together for a long while, wrapped in comfortable silence broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and the gentle whisper of snow falling steadily outside. Whatever challenges still waited ahead, Elinor felt confident, for the first time since her arrival at Ashfield Manor, that whatever came, they would face it together, bound now not merely by arrangement or obligation, but by a genuine, hard-won love that had grown steadily stronger through every trial they had faced side by side. Yet even in this moment of quiet contentment, a small, persistent thought lingered somewhere in the back of Elinor's mind, a whisper of unease she could not entirely silence. Isabel's return, however peacefully resolved it had seemed, had opened a door to the past that Elinor sensed might not remain so easily closed. And somewhere beyond the peaceful walls of Ashfield Manor, beyond the warm glow of their winter fire, forces neither of them yet anticipated were already beginning to stir, forces that would soon test the fragile trust they had worked so carefully to build. That opportunity to test their bond arrived sooner than either of them expected, though not in the form Elinor had anticipated. It began, innocently enough, with a visit from Lord Grayson, a neighboring landowner whose family had long maintained cordial, if somewhat distant, relations with the Whitmore family. He arrived at Ashfield Manor on a bright winter afternoon, ostensibly to discuss matters concerning a shared boundary between their estates, though Alina sensed almost immediately that his true purpose extended beyond mere property lines. Lord Grayson was a charming man, quick with compliments and easy conversation, and Alina found herself seated beside him during tea while Edward attended to estate business with the man's steward in a separate room. It was during this brief interlude that Grayson's true intentions began to reveal themselves, subtle at first, then increasingly less so. "You must find life here rather quiet, Duchess," he said, his tone light but his eyes watchful. "A young woman of your evident spirit, confined to such a remote estate. I confess I find myself curious how you occupy your days." "I find plenty to occupy myself, my lord," Alina replied carefully, sensing something beneath his casual words that made her wary. "I have taken up painting recently, and there is always much to attend to regarding the household and the tenants." "Painting?" Grayson repeated, a faint smile playing at his lips. "How charming, though I imagine even the most devoted painter occasionally longs for livelier company than an estate steeped in old grief and careful silence can provide." Alina's spine stiffened slightly at the implication in his words. "I have found Ashfield Manor to be a place of genuine warmth, my lord, whatever reputation it may have carried in years past." "Of course," Grayson said smoothly, though something calculating remained in his expression. "Forgive me. I only meant to suggest that should you ever find yourself in want of company, my own household would welcome your visits most warmly." The conversation left Alina unsettled, though she said nothing of it to Edward that evening, uncertain whether she had simply misread an innocent comment or correctly identified something more troubling beneath Grayson's polished manners. She did mention it, however, to Margaret the following morning, hoping the housekeeper's years of experience within these social circles might offer some clarity. "Lord Grayson," Margaret said, her expression growing notably guarded at the mention of his name. "I would advise caution, my lady, where that gentleman is concerned. He has a history of complications, shall we say, within families not his own. Several marriages in the county have suffered considerably from his particular brand of charm." "You believe he intends some mischief?" Alina asked, alarm creeping into her voice. "I believe, my lady, that Lord Grayson enjoys nothing more than disrupting happiness he did not create himself," Margaret said carefully. "Your marriage to the Duke has become something of a topic among the local gentry, given how swiftly and genuinely your affection for one another has grown despite its arranged beginnings. Such genuine happiness sometimes attracts those who envy it, particularly men like Lord Grayson, who have never managed to secure such contentment within their own households." Alina considered this warning carefully, resolving to maintain careful distance from Lord Grayson going forward, whatever polite social obligations might occasionally require their paths to cross. She did not yet realize, standing there in the quiet morning light of the manor's kitchen, just how determined Grayson would prove in the weeks ahead, nor how close his calculated mischief would come to unraveling the fragile trust she and Edward had worked so patiently to build. For now, however, life at Ashfield Manor continued its peaceful winter rhythm, undisturbed by the quiet storm gathering just beyond its walls. Alina spent her days painting, tending to household matters, and growing ever closer to the husband who had become, against every expectation she carried into this marriage, the truest companion she had ever known. Whatever challenges Lord Grayson's calculated interest might eventually bring, Alina felt confident, wrapped in the warmth of her growing love for Edward, that their bond had grown strong enough to weather whatever storms still waited on the horizon. Little did she know how severely that confidence would soon be tested. That night, as she lay beside Edward in the quiet darkness of their chamber, Alina found herself thinking again of Margaret's warning, turning the housekeeper's careful words over in her mind. She did not wish to burden Edward with unfounded suspicions, not when their happiness together had grown so steadily precious to her. So she said nothing yet of Grayson's unsettling visit, choosing instead to simply hold onto the warmth of the man sleeping peacefully beside her. Edward stirred slightly, drawing her closer in his sleep, and Alina felt a rush of tenderness so complete it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Whatever difficulties still waited beyond these walls, whatever schemes ambitious neighbors might quietly nurture, she resolved to face them with the same patience and honesty that had carried her and Edward through every trial thus far. Their love, however unconventional its beginning, had grown into something real, something worth protecting fiercely against whatever storms might come. She closed her eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing beside her, and allowed herself, for tonight at least, to rest peacefully within the quiet certainty of what they had built together, unaware of just how soon that certainty would face its greatest test yet. The rumor reached Alina's ears on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday, carried through the careful whispers of servants who thought her out of earshot. She had been walking past the kitchen corridor when she caught fragments of a conversation between two maids, their voices hushed, but not quite hushed enough, saying the Duke was seen leaving Lord Grayson's estate late at night, meeting privately with Lady Grayson while his own wife slept unaware. Alina froze in the corridor, her heart pounding as the words settled over her like a cold weight. She waited until the maids had moved on before continuing toward the drawing room, her mind racing through a dozen possible explanations, none of them entirely satisfying the growing unease building in her chest. She said nothing to Edward that evening, uncertain how to broach such an accusation without sounding either foolish or accusatory. But the rumor did not remain contained to whispered servant gossip for long. 2 days later, Charlotte arrived at Ashfield Manor with an expression far more troubled than Alina had ever seen on her usually bright, cheerful features. "You must tell me this is not true," Charlotte said, barely waiting until they were alone in the parlor before speaking. "The entire county is whispering about Edward's supposed visits to the Grayson estate. Lady Ashworth mentioned it to me at church only yesterday, quite pointedly, as though testing whether I already knew." Alina felt the blood drain from her face. "I have heard the rumor myself from the servants. I have said nothing to Edward yet. I did not know how to raise such a delicate matter without seeming to accuse him unjustly." "You must ask him directly," Charlotte urged. "These rumors do not simply appear from nothing, Alina. Someone is spreading them deliberately, and I fear I know exactly who benefits from such damage to my brother's reputation and marriage." "Lord Grayson," Alina said quietly, thinking of Margaret's earlier warning, of his unsettling comments during that first uncomfortable visit. "Precisely," Charlotte confirmed. "I have long suspected he harbors some resentment toward Edward, dating back to a business dispute between our fathers years ago. What better revenge than to destroy the happiness Edward has finally found, using nothing more than carefully planted whispers?" That evening, Alina found herself unable to hold her silence any longer. She confronted Edward directly after dinner, her voice trembling slightly despite her determination to remain composed. "There are rumors," she said, watching his expression carefully, "that you have been visiting Lord Grayson's estate at night, meeting privately with his wife." The shock that crossed Edward's face seemed, to Alina's relief, entirely genuine. "Alina, I swear to you, I have not set foot on Grayson's property in months, and certainly never at night, and never to meet privately with his wife." "This is an outright fabrication." "Then where have these rumors originated?" Alina asked, though she already suspected the answer. "I do not know," Edward said, frustration evident in his voice. "Though I confess Grayson has shown a peculiar interest in matters that concern our household of late. His steward has raised several minor disputes regarding our shared boundary that seem designed more to create friction than resolve any genuine grievance." Despite Edward's clear denial, despite the evident sincerity in his voice and expression, Alina found herself troubled by a small, persistent doubt she could not entirely dismiss. It was not that she believed him capable of such betrayal, not truly, but the accumulated weight of the rumor, combined with the county's evident willingness to believe it, planted a seed of uncertainty that proved difficult to fully uproot. "I believe you," she said finally, though her voice lacked complete conviction even to her own ears. Edward noticed the hesitation immediately, his expression falling into something wounded and uncertain. "Do you truly believe me, Alina? Or do you simply wish to believe me, despite doubts you cannot quite silence?" "I do not know how to answer that honestly," Alina admitted, hating the pain that flickered across his features at her words. "I trust you, Edward, I do. But these rumors have grown so persistent, so detailed in their claims, that I confess a small part of me wonders if there is some truth buried beneath the exaggeration." The conversation that followed grew increasingly strained. Both of them wounded by doubts and accusations neither had anticipated needing to voice so soon after the genuine warmth they had built together over recent months. Edward, hurt by Alina's evident hesitation despite his sincere denials, retreated into a guarded silence Alina had not seen from him since the earliest days of their marriage. Alina, frustrated by her own inability to fully silence her doubts despite genuinely wanting to trust him completely, found herself withdrawing as well, the warm intimacy of recent months replaced by a careful, painful distance neither of them seemed able to bridge. Days passed in this uncomfortable tension, meals shared in stilted silence, evenings spent in separate rooms rather than the comfortable companionship they had grown accustomed to sharing. Alina found herself missing the easy warmth of their recent months together, yet unable to fully release the doubt that had settled so persistently in her chest, however unfair she recognized that doubt to be. It was Margaret who finally intervened, cornering Alina in the quiet of the library one afternoon with an expression of unusual firmness. "My lady, forgive my boldness, but I have watched this household grow warm and happy over these past months, only to see that happiness crumble now over rumors I know for certain to be false." "You know this for certain?" Alina asked, surprised by Margaret's conviction. "I have served this family for over a decade, my lady," Margaret said. "I know the Duke's habits, his schedule, his character, better than perhaps anyone save yourself. He has not left this estate at night in all the months since your marriage, save for the emergency the night of your accident. These rumors are fabrications, my lady, spread by someone with clear intention to cause exactly this kind of doubt and distance between you and his grace." "Lord Grayson," Alina said quietly. "I cannot say for certain who spread such lies," Margaret said carefully, "but I know the Duke's heart, my lady, and I know it belongs entirely to you. Do not let poison planted by someone else's malice destroy something as precious as what you have built together." Margaret's words settled deeply into Alina's heart, cutting through the fog of doubt that had clouded her judgment these past difficult days. She thought of Edward's genuine shock and hurt when she first raised the accusation, the sincerity in his denial, the pain in his eyes when he realized her trust had wavered despite everything they had built together. Shame flooded through her at how easily she had allowed manufactured rumor to overshadow months of genuine, hard-won intimacy. She found Edward that evening in his study, exactly where she had found him on so many earlier occasions throughout their marriage, though tonight his posture carried a weariness that had not been there before this painful misunderstanding began. "Edward," she said softly, closing the door behind her, "I am so sorry. I allowed doubt planted by malicious rumor to overshadow everything I know to be true about your character, about the love you have shown me these past months. Margaret helped me see clearly what I should have recognized immediately myself. You would never betray the trust we have built together." Edward looked up, something cautiously hopeful flickering across his tired features. "You believe me now fully, without hesitation." "I believe you completely," Alina said firmly. "I am ashamed it took me these several painful days to fully silence the doubt that never should have taken root in the first place. Can you forgive me for allowing it to distance us these past days?" He rose from his desk and crossed the room to stand before her, reaching out to gently cup her face in his hands. "There is nothing to forgive, Alina. Rumors carefully crafted by someone determined to cause harm can unsettle even the strongest trust, at least momentarily. What matters is that you found your way back to clarity, back to us, before the damage grew too severe to repair." Relief flooded through Alina at his words, and she leaned into his gentle touch, grateful beyond measure that their brief separation had not caused permanent harm to the fragile trust they had worked so carefully to build. "I love you," she said softly, the words slipping out naturally, unplanned though entirely true. "I do not think I have said those words to you before, not directly, though I have felt them growing within me for some time now." Something profound shifted in Edward's expression at her words, a vulnerability and joy so complete it nearly took Eleanor's breath away. "I love you as well, Eleanor, more completely than I ever believed myself capable of loving anyone again, after everything that came before you entered my life." They remained there together for a long moment, foreheads pressed together, hands intertwined, the painful distance of recent days finally dissolving into renewed closeness and understanding. Yet even as relief and joy flooded through her, Eleanor knew this reconciliation, however genuine and complete, had not yet resolved the underlying threat that had caused their painful misunderstanding in the first place. Lord Grayson's malicious rumors remained unaddressed, his motives for spreading such damaging lies still unclear, and Eleanor sensed, with quiet certainty, that he would not simply abandon his scheme after this first attempt had ultimately failed to permanently damage their marriage. Whatever Grayson's true purpose in spreading such calculated lies, Eleanor resolved, standing there in Edward's embrace with their renewed trust settling warmly between them, that she and Edward would face whatever further schemes he might attempt together, openly, honestly, refusing to allow manufactured doubt to ever again threaten the genuine, hard-won love they had built so carefully over these past months. That confirmation arrived sooner than either of them expected. Barely a week after their reconciliation, Edward received a visit from his own steward, Mr. Collins, who arrived at the manor with troubling news regarding the very boundary dispute Edward had mentioned earlier as a source of friction with Grayson's estate. "Your Grace," Collins said, laying out a set of documents across the study desk, "I have discovered something rather concerning while reviewing these boundary records. It appears Lord Grayson's steward has been deliberately misrepresenting old survey lines, attempting to claim nearly 20 acres of Ashfield land that rightfully belongs to this estate." Edward's expression darkened as he examined the documents Collins presented. "This is no accident, then. This is deliberate deception." "I believe so, Your Grace," Collins confirmed. "Combined with the rumors that have been circulating through the county regarding your supposed visits to the Grayson estate, I confess I find myself suspicious that both matters trace back to the same source and the same motive." Eleanor, who had been present during the conversation, felt a chill settle over her at this confirmation of what she and Charlotte had already suspected. He seeks to damage Edward's reputation and steal his land simultaneously, hoping perhaps that the resulting distraction and marital discord would leave the estate too weakened to properly contest the boundary claim. "A reasonable theory, my lady," Collins agreed, "though proving deliberate malice will require careful documentation and perhaps legal consultation." Edward's jaw tightened with a resolve Eleanor recognized immediately, the same quiet determination he had shown during her recovery months earlier, transformed now into protective anger on behalf of his family and estate. "Then, we shall gather whatever documentation proves necessary, Collins. I will not allow Lord Grayson to profit from lies and manufactured scandal, whatever his ultimate motive might be." The following weeks brought a flurry of careful investigation. As Collins worked alongside Edward to gather old survey records, tenant testimonies, and legal documentation proving the true boundaries of Ashfield's land, Eleanor found herself drawn into these efforts as well, her sharp memory proving useful in recalling small details from conversations and documents that helped strengthen their case against Grayson's fraudulent claims. Throughout this period, Eleanor noticed a renewed closeness growing between herself and Edward, forged now not merely through shared vulnerability during her recovery or quiet conversations by the fire, but through this shared purpose, this united front against a threat that sought to divide them. Working alongside him through long evenings reviewing documents, watching his careful, methodical approach to protecting what belonged rightfully to his family, Eleanor found her love and respect for him deepening even further. "You handle this so calmly," she observed one evening, watching him carefully cross-reference dates across several old survey maps. "I confess I feel far more anger toward Grayson than you appear to be showing." "Anger clouds judgment," Edward said, not looking up from his work. "I learned that lesson painfully after my mother's death, when grief nearly consumed every rational thought I possessed. Better to channel this anger into careful, methodical action that will genuinely resolve the matter, rather than allowing it to consume energy better spent protecting what matters most." "And what matters most?" Elinor asked softly. He looked up then, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. "You, Elinor. This estate, these tenants who depend upon us, the life we have built together these past months. Grayson sought to threaten all of that through calculated deception, and I intend to ensure he fails completely, restoring not merely the boundary lines he attempted to steal, but the peace and trust he sought to destroy between us." His words settled warmly in Elinor's chest, reminding her once again how far they had traveled together since that first uncertain evening of her arrival at Ashfield Manor. Whatever schemes Lord Grayson continued to nurture, whatever further attempts he might make to divide them or damage their happiness, Elinor felt confident that the foundation they had built together, tested now through genuine hardship and misunderstanding, had grown strong enough to withstand whatever remained ahead. Yet even amid this renewed confidence, a small, persistent unease lingered in the back of Elinor's mind. Grayson had already proven himself willing to employ deception and manufactured scandal to achieve his aims. Elinor could not shake the feeling that his current scheme, now exposed and being carefully countered through legal documentation, might simply be a prelude to some further, more desperate attempt, should this initial effort ultimately fail to achieve his goals. She did not have long to wonder whether that instinct proved correct. Word arrived through Charlotte, barely a fortnight later, that Lord Grayson had grown increasingly desperate after learning of Edward's careful legal countermeasures. His fraudulent boundary claim now thoroughly undone by the documentation Collins had so diligently gathered. Rather than accepting defeat gracefully, Charlotte reported, Grayson had begun making veiled threats within certain social circles, suggesting he possessed further damaging information about the Whitmore family that he intended to reveal, should his boundary claim not be honored. What further information could he possibly claim to possess? Elinor asked, alarm creeping into her voice as Charlotte relayed this troubling news. "I do not know," Charlotte admitted, her own expression troubled. "Though knowing Grayson's character, I suspect it may be nothing more than further fabrication, designed simply to frighten us into conceding his fraudulent claim rather than risk whatever scandal he threatens to manufacture." Edward, when informed of this development, grew unusually quiet, his expression carrying a weight Elinor had not seen since those early days of their marriage, before trust had fully bloomed between them. "Whatever he claims to know," he said finally, "we shall face it together honestly, refusing to let fear of scandal dictate our actions. I will not surrender rightful land to a man willing to threat and deceive so shamelessly." Elinor reached for his hand, drawing strength from his resolve even as uncertainty lingered about what further schemes Grayson might attempt. "Together," she agreed firmly, echoing the promise they had made to each other months earlier, during her long recovery from injury. Whatever storm Grayson intended to unleash upon them next, Elinor felt certain that facing it side by side, honestly and without secrets between them, would prove their strongest defense against whatever malice still waited ahead. Lord Grayson's final scheme arrived in the form of a public accusation delivered at the worst possible moment, during a large gathering hosted by Lord Pemberton to celebrate the coming spring season. The room had been full of laughter and easy conversation when Grayson approached, his expression carrying a calculated confidence that immediately put Elinor on edge. "Duke Whitmore," he said loudly enough that nearby conversations quieted, drawn by the evident challenge in his tone, "I wonder if you have shared with your lovely wife the full truth regarding your family's finances. I understand Ashfield's accounts have grown rather strained in recent years. Strained enough that some might question whether your recent marriage was motivated by genuine affection or simple financial necessity. The accusation, delivered with such deliberate public cruelty, sent a ripple of shocked whispers through the surrounding guests. Alina felt her cheeks flush with anger and embarrassment, though she forced herself to remain composed, refusing to give Grayson the satisfaction of visible distress. "My finances are my own concern, Lord Grayson," Edward replied evenly, though Alina could sense the barely controlled anger beneath his careful composure. "I fail to see what business they are of yours, nor why you would choose to raise such matters in so public a setting." "Perhaps because your wife deserves to know the truth," Grayson pressed, clearly enjoying the growing attention their exchange had attracted. "Or has she never wondered why a duke of your standing agreed so readily to marry a merchant's daughter with no significant fortune of her own?" Alina felt the words land like a physical blow, old insecurities she thought long resolved suddenly resurfacing with painful clarity. Had their entire marriage, despite everything they had built together these past months, truly begun as nothing more than financial necessity on Edward's part? "That is quite enough," Edward said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge Alina had never heard from him before. "Whatever petty grievance you continue to nurture regarding our boundary dispute, Grayson, I will not allow you to slander my marriage before witnesses simply to satisfy your own bitterness." "Slander?" Grayson repeated, feigning offense. "I merely speak plain truth, Your Grace. Ashfield's finances have been common knowledge among the local gentry for years. I only wonder why your wife has never questioned the timing of your sudden marriage, arriving so conveniently just as your family's debts grew most pressing." The gathering had grown entirely silent now, every eye fixed upon this uncomfortable confrontation, and Alina felt panic rising in her chest as old doubts she had believed thoroughly resolved months earlier, suddenly threatened to resurface with painful new force. Had Charlotte's earlier reassurances about Edward's growing affection been mere kindness rather than truth? Had the tender care he showed during her recovery, the genuine warmth of their shared evenings by the fire, all simply been elaborate performance masking a marriage of pure financial convenience? Edward turned to look at her then, and something in his expression, fierce and protective and entirely genuine, cut through the panic beginning to cloud Alina's thoughts. "Alina," he said, his voice softening despite the public setting, "whatever financial considerations existed when this marriage was first arranged, you must know they hold no bearing whatsoever on what has grown between us since. I did not fall in love with you because of any fortune, real or imagined. I fell in love with your kindness, your courage, your patience in waiting long enough to see past walls I had spent years building around my heart." His words, delivered with such raw sincerity before the entire gathering, silenced whatever panic had begun building within Alina's chest. She looked at him, this man who had once seemed so distant and unreachable, now standing before witnesses declaring his genuine love without hesitation or embarrassment, and felt her earlier doubt dissolve completely into renewed certainty. "I know that," she said softly, though her voice carried clearly through the silent room. "I have known it for some time now, Edward. Whatever Lord Grayson hopes to accomplish through these cruel accusations, he cannot manufacture doubt where none genuinely exists." Grayson's confident expression faltered slightly at this unexpected display of unified certainty, clearly having anticipated a very different reaction from his calculated public accusation. "Touching," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Though financial necessity remains financial necessity, whatever romantic sentiment you now claim has developed since." "And what of your own motives, Lord Grayson?" Charlotte's voice cut sharply through the tension, as she stepped forward from the surrounding crowd with an expression of fierce protectiveness Alina had not seen from her before. "Shall we discuss the fraudulent boundary claim you attempted against my brother's estate, thoroughly documented and proven false through careful legal investigation? Or perhaps we should discuss the malicious rumors you spread regarding secret meetings with your own wife, rumors proven equally baseless upon examination?" Murmurs of surprise rippled through the gathered guests at this new revelation. attention shifting rapidly from Edward and Alina's supposed marital difficulties toward Grayson's own increasingly evident scheming. His confident composure finally cracked fully under this public exposure, anger flashing across his features before he could master his expression once more. "This is outrageous," he sputtered, though his protest carried little conviction given the growing skeptical murmurs from those around him. "I have done nothing but speak honest truth regarding matters of legitimate public interest." "You have done nothing but spread calculated lies in an attempt to destroy a marriage and steal land that rightfully belongs to another family," Charlotte replied firmly, her voice carrying clearly across the now thoroughly attentive gathering. "I suggest, Lord Grayson, that you consider very carefully whether continuing this pattern of behavior serves your own reputation any better than it has served your fraudulent claims against my brother's estate." The confrontation ended shortly after, Grayson retreating from the gathering amid pointed whispers and skeptical glances that suggested his standing among the local gentry had suffered significant damage from this public exposure of his schemes. Alina watched him go with a complicated mixture of relief and lingering unease, grateful the confrontation had ended in their favor, yet still shaken by how close his cruel accusation had come to reopening wounds she believed fully healed. Later that evening, once they had returned to the relative privacy of their carriage, Alina finally allowed the emotion she had carefully suppressed throughout the confrontation to surface fully. "I am sorry," she said quietly, tears finally spilling down her cheeks despite her efforts to remain composed. "For that moment of doubt, however brief. I know our love is genuine, Edward. I have known it for months now." But his words still found some old, insecure corner of my heart. "I thought it healed long ago." Edward drew her gently into his arms, his hand moving soothingly across her back as her tears finally released the tension of the evening's confrontation. "There is nothing to apologize for, Alina." Grayson chose his words precisely to exploit exactly that kind of lingering insecurity. "That you recovered so quickly, that you stood beside me so firmly despite that brief doubt, speaks only to the genuine strength of what we have built together, not to any weakness in your trust." "It aches," Alina whispered against his shoulder, remembering how close we came to letting his lies plant doubt between us again. "It does ache," Edward agreed softly, pressing a gentle kiss against her hair. "But we faced it together, Alina, honestly and without secrets, exactly as we promised each other we would. That is what matters most. Not that difficulty arose, but that we met it side by side, refusing to let manufactured doubt separate us." Alina pulled back slightly to look up at him, something fierce and certain settling into her expression despite the tears still drying on her cheeks. "I want to try again," she said softly, completely, without any lingering doubt or hesitation. "Whatever challenges still wait ahead, Edward, I choose you, fully and freely, not from arrangement or necessity, but from genuine love that has grown steadily stronger through every trial we have faced together." "As do I," Edward replied, his voice thick with emotion as he cupped her face gently in his hands. "Completely and without reservation, Alina. Whatever began this marriage, whatever circumstance first brought us together, I choose you now, and I will continue choosing you every single day for as long as we both shall live." Their carriage continued its journey back toward Ashfield Manor through the quiet darkness of the spring evening, but within its confines, something profound had shifted between them. A final resolution of doubt and insecurity replaced by complete, unshakable certainty in the genuine love they had built together against every obstacle circumstance and malice had placed in their path. News of Lord Grayson's public humiliation spread quickly through the county in the days following the gathering, and Alina found herself relieved to notice a marked shift in how their marriage was now discussed among the local gentry. Where once whispered rumors had questioned Edward's motives and the genuineness of their affection, now conversations turned instead toward admiration for how firmly and openly they had stood together against manufactured scandal, their bond emerging from the ordeal stronger and more publicly evident than ever before. Lord Pemberton himself called upon them within the week, offering both apology for the disruption Grayson had caused at his gathering and quiet admiration for how gracefully they had handled such a difficult public confrontation. "Your marriage has become something of an inspiration among the local families," he confided during his visit, "proof that genuine affection can indeed grow from even the most practical of arrangements, given sufficient patience and honesty between two willing hearts." Elinor found herself smiling at these words, thinking of how far she and Edward had traveled since that first uncertain evening of her arrival at Ashfield Manor, frightened and uncertain about the stranger she had been sent to marry. That fear seemed impossibly distant now, replaced by a certainty and contentment she had never dared hope to find within an arranged union. Charlotte, too, seemed lighter in the days following the confrontation, her earlier anxiety about Grayson's threats replaced by evident satisfaction at having witnessed her brother's genuine happiness so publicly affirmed. "I confess I have never felt prouder of you both," she told them one evening, joining them for dinner at Ashfield Manor. "Watching you stand together against such calculated cruelty, refusing to let doubt divide you, it reminded me exactly why I hoped so fervently that this marriage might grow into something real, all those months ago when it was first arranged. We could not have weathered it so successfully without your support, Charlotte," Elinor said warmly, genuinely grateful for the sister-in-law who had become, over these past months, something closer to a true sister than mere family connection through marriage. "Your intervention at the gathering proved decisive in exposing Grayson's true motives before the entire county. I could not simply stand by and watch him attempt to destroy something so genuinely precious," Charlotte said, waving away the gratitude with characteristic modesty. "Besides, it gave me great satisfaction watching his composure crumble once his own schemes were exposed so publicly. I do not believe Lord Grayson will trouble this family again any time soon, given how thoroughly his reputation has suffered from this evening's revelations." As spring bloomed fully across the Ashfield estate in the weeks that followed, Elinor found herself reflecting often on the journey that had brought her to this point, from frightened stranger arriving in a rain-soaked carriage to genuinely beloved wife, standing confidently beside a husband who had proven, through countless trials both large and small, the depth and sincerity of his devotion. Whatever uncertainty had once clouded their beginning, whatever doubts Grayson's cruel scheming had briefly reawakened, Elinor felt only gratitude now for the genuine, hard-won love that had grown steadily between them, tested and proven strong through every difficulty they had faced together. One warm evening, as the sun set golden over the gardens Elinor had come to love so dearly, Edward found her seated before her easel, capturing the last light of day across the blooming rose bushes near the old chapel. He watched quietly for a moment before speaking, admiring both the painting taking shape beneath her careful hands and the woman herself, so different now from the frightened stranger who had once stood uncertainly in this very garden. "You have found your joy again," he observed softly, settling beside her on the garden bench. "We have found it together," Elinor corrected gently, leaning into his familiar warmth. "I do not think I could have discovered this contentment alone, Edward, whatever talent for painting I once set aside. It required your patience, your willingness to open your own guarded heart before I could truly open mine in return." He pressed a tender kiss against her temple, and together they watched the sun continue its slow descent beyond the garden walls, two hearts that had once been strangers now bound together by something far deeper than mere arrangement or circumstance, something genuine and hard-won that neither malice nor doubt had proven strong enough to destroy. A full year had passed since Elinor first arrived at Ashfield Manor as a frightened stranger, and the transformation that had taken place within those 12 months seemed, on quiet reflective evenings like this one, almost impossible to fully comprehend. She stood now in the same entrance hall where she had once added a single fresh flower to a dusty, long-neglected arrangement, watching as servants bustled about preparing for the celebration planned that evening, their first wedding anniversary. The old vase still held its place of honor near the entrance, though it no longer contained the same faded, sorrowful flowers that had greeted her on that first rainy evening. Instead, fresh blooms filled it now, gathered daily from the very gardens Alina had grown to love so dearly. A living symbol of how thoroughly grief and new joy had learned to exist together within these once melancholy walls. "You look radiant," Edward said, appearing beside her with the quiet warmth that had become so natural between them over these past months. "Though I confess I find you equally radiant on ordinary mornings over breakfast, so perhaps I am simply biased in my assessment." Alina laughed softly, leaning into his familiar embrace. "A year ago, I stood in this very spot, terrified of the stranger I had just married, uncertain whether I could ever find happiness within these walls." "And now?" he asked, though his tone carried the quiet confidence of a man who already knew the answer. "Now I cannot imagine any greater happiness than what we have built together," Alina said honestly. "You have given me more than I ever dared hope for from this arrangement, Edward. Genuine love, deep friendship, a home that finally feels entirely my own rather than a stranger's house I merely inhabit." Their anniversary celebration that evening brought together family and friends who had witnessed their journey over the past year, Charlotte glowing with evident pride as she watched her brother and sister-in-law together, Margaret beaming quietly from her position overseeing the household staff, even Dr. Whitfield attending, having grown genuinely fond of the young Duchess whose recovery he had overseen so carefully the previous autumn. Isabel sent her congratulations by letter, having married recently herself to a kind gentleman she had met shortly after her return to England, her note carrying genuine warmth and no trace of the old complications that had once threatened to overshadow Edward and Alina's growing marriage. Lord Grayson, notably, remained entirely absent from local society these days, having quietly relocated his primary residence following the thorough exposure of his schemes the previous spring, his attempted mischief ultimately serving only to strengthen the very marriage he had sought to destroy. As the celebration continued into the evening, Alina found herself pulled aside by Charlotte, who wore an expression of barely contained excitement. "I have something rather important to discuss with you," Charlotte said, practically bouncing with evident eagerness, "though I suspect you may already know what I intend to say." "Charlotte," Alina said, laughing at her sister-in-law's obvious excitement, "whatever could put you in such high spirits this evening?" "Only that I have noticed certain changes in you these past weeks," Charlotte said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "A certain glow, a tendency toward afternoon fatigue you have never shown before, an aversion to the smell of coffee that Margaret mentioned to me just yesterday. Alina, dearest, are you perhaps expecting?" Alina felt heat rush to her cheeks, both from surprise at Charlotte's perceptive observation and from the joyful confirmation she had only recently allowed herself to fully believe. "Dr. Whitfield confirmed it only 3 days ago," she admitted softly. "I have not yet told Edward. I wish to find the right moment, perhaps this very evening, given the significance of the occasion." Charlotte's excited squeal drew several curious glances from nearby guests, though she quickly composed herself, embracing Alina warmly. "This is the most wonderful news imaginable. Edward will be overjoyed, Alina. I have never seen my brother so completely transformed as he has been this past year, and I cannot imagine how much greater that joy will grow with news of an approaching child." Later that evening, once most guests had departed, and only close family remained gathered in the drawing room, Alina found the perfect quiet moment to share her news with Edward. She drew him aside to the same window where they had once stood together during her recovery, watching autumn light fade across the gardens below. "I have something to tell you," she said softly, taking both his hands in hers. "Something I believe will bring you great joy, though I confess I find myself somewhat nervous sharing it, however wonderful the news itself may be." "Alina," Edward said, concern flickering briefly across his features at her evident nervousness, "whatever it is, you know you can share anything with me." "We are going to have a child," she said finally, watching his expression carefully as the words settled fully into his understanding. For a long moment, Edward simply stared at her, as though struggling to fully comprehend such profound news. Then, slowly, an expression of pure, Unguarded joy spread across his features, unlike anything Alina had witnessed from him even during their happiest moments together over the past year. "A child," he repeated softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Alina, this is. I do not have words sufficient to express what I feel in this moment." He drew her gently into his arms, and Alina felt tears of joy sliding down her cheeks as he held her close, his hand moving with careful tenderness to rest against her still flat stomach, as though he could already sense the small life beginning to grow within her. "I never dared hope for such complete happiness," he admitted quietly. "A year ago, I was a man who believed himself incapable of love, resigned to a life of careful distance and guarded solitude. Now I find myself not only deeply in love with the most remarkable woman I have ever known, but soon to become a father as well. I do not know how I came to deserve such profound blessing." "You deserve it because you were brave enough to open your heart again, despite the pain that came before," Alina said softly, cupping his face gently in her hands. "Because you showed me, through countless small acts of patience and genuine care, that trust once broken can indeed be rebuilt into something stronger and more precious than what existed before." They remained there together for a long while, wrapped in quiet joy and wonder at the new chapter beginning to unfold before them, while behind them, the sounds of Charlotte's continued excited chatter and Margaret's quiet, satisfied smile filled the warm drawing room with the comfortable sounds of a household that had finally, completely, become a true and happy home. The months that followed brought their own quiet joys and challenges. As Alina's pregnancy progressed and preparations for the coming child filled the halls of Ashfield Manor with renewed purpose and anticipation. Edward proved, as Alina had known he would, an attentive and devoted partner throughout. His earlier tenderness during her recovery from injury now transformed into equally careful attention toward her comfort and well-being as her pregnancy advanced. They spent long evenings discussing possible names, debating whether their child would inherit Alina's artistic sensibility or Edward's careful, methodical mind, imagining together the future that awaited this new addition to their family. Charlotte visited constantly, already devoted to her future niece or nephew despite the months still remaining before the birth, while Margaret quietly began preparing the old nursery, long unused since Edward's own childhood, with the same careful devotion she had shown throughout her years of service to this family. When their daughter finally arrived on a bright spring morning, nearly 9 months after that joyful anniversary celebration, Alina felt the last remaining traces of her earlier fear and uncertainty about this marriage dissolve completely into pure, overwhelming love. She watched Edward hold their newborn daughter for the first time, his expression carrying such profound tenderness and wonder that Alina felt her heart might burst from the sheer weight of her love for this man who had once seemed so distant and unreachable. "She has your eyes," Edward observed softly, studying their daughter's small, peaceful features with evident wonder. "And your steady patience, I suspect, given how calmly she has slept through all this commotion," Alina said, laughing softly despite her exhaustion from the birth. They named her Margaret, in honor of the housekeeper, whose quiet wisdom and steady presence had helped guide them through some of their most difficult early challenges together. The housekeeper herself wept openly upon learning of this honor, her usual composed reserve finally breaking completely at such a touching tribute to her years of devoted service. As Alina settled into the quiet rhythms of new motherhood, surrounded by a household that had grown to feel entirely her own, she often found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this point. The frightened young woman who had arrived at Ashfield Manor in a rain-soaked carriage, uncertain whether she could ever find happiness in an arranged marriage to a stranger, had become someone entirely different. A woman confident in her husband's genuine love, secure in the family they had built together, grateful beyond measure for every trial and triumph that had shaped their journey. Watching Edward one evening, holding their daughter gently before the same fireplace where they had first begun truly opening their hearts to each other, Alina felt overwhelming gratitude for how completely their marriage had transformed from careful arrangement into genuine, deeply rooted love. Whatever practical necessity had first brought them together, whatever doubts and challenges had tested their bond along the way, they had emerged from every trial stronger and more devoted than before, their love proving itself genuine through action and patience rather than mere words alone. "What are you thinking?" Edward asked softly, noticing her thoughtful expression as he gently rocked their sleeping daughter. "Only how grateful I am," Elinor said, settling beside him on the settee. "That fate or circumstance or whatever force first brought us together chose so wisely, even when neither of us had any say in the matter." Edward smiled softly, reaching for her hand while carefully maintaining his gentle hold on their sleeping child. "I believe, Elinor, that whatever brought us together initially, it was our own choices afterward, our willingness to be patient, honest, and brave enough to love fully despite past hurts, that truly created what we now share. Arrangement may have opened the door, but we chose, together, to walk through it fully, building something far greater than either of us imagined possible on that first uncertain evening." Outside, spring continued its gentle bloom across the Ashfield gardens, flowers opening steadily beneath warm sunshine, much like the love that had grown so patiently and completely between two people who had once been nothing more than strangers bound by circumstance, now transformed into devoted partners building a genuine, joyful life together, one quiet, precious moment at a time. In the years that followed little Margaret's birth, Ashfield Manor continued to flourish as a home filled with warmth and genuine happiness, so different from the quiet, sorrowful house Elinor had first entered as an uncertain bride. 2 more children eventually joined their growing family. A son named Henry who inherited his father's thoughtful, careful temperament, and a younger daughter, Grace, who showed early signs of Elinor's own artistic sensibilities, filling every available surface with cheerful, colorful drawings. Edward proved as devoted a father as he had been a husband, spending countless hours teaching his children about the estate's history, walking with them through the same gardens where he had once found renewed hope alongside Elinor, sharing with them the very compassion and gentleness he had once believed lost forever after his own difficult childhood. Watching him with their children, Elinor often thought back to that quiet confession he had shared during their first winter together, his long-abandoned dream of becoming a physician, and found herself smiling at how naturally that same gentle, healing compassion now expressed itself through his careful, loving fatherhood. Charlotte remained a constant, beloved presence throughout these years, eventually finding her own happiness in marriage to a kind gentleman she met during one of her frequent visits to London, though she continued visiting Ashfield often enough that her nieces and nephew came to consider her almost a second mother, always ready with cheerful stories and unwavering affection. Margaret the housekeeper continued her devoted service for many more years, watching with quiet pride as the family she had served through its most difficult chapter grew steadily into one of genuine warmth and happiness. She often told young Margaret, her small namesake, stories of how her parents had first met, how patience and honesty had transformed a practical arrangement into genuine, lasting love, stories the little girl never tired of hearing, no matter how many times they were repeated. Elinor's paintings, meanwhile, grew increasingly accomplished over the years, eventually earning quiet recognition among local artistic circles, though she never sought fame or wider acclaim, content simply to capture the beauty of the life she had built at Ashfield, the gardens, her growing children, and always in some quiet corner of nearly every canvas. Some small tribute to the husband, whose patient love had first taught her that even the most unlikely beginnings could grow into something genuinely beautiful. On quiet evenings, long after their children had grown and built lives and families of their own, Elinor and Edward would often sit together in that same drawing room where their story had truly begun, watching the fire crackle softly while remembering the long journey that had brought them to this contented peace. The old vase near the entrance still held fresh flowers, gathered daily from gardens that had witnessed every chapter of their shared history, a living testament to how grief and joy, old wounds and new beginnings, could indeed learn to exist together, patiently, beautifully, for a lifetime and beyond. "Do you ever wonder," Alina asked one such evening, many years after that first uncertain carriage ride through the rain, "what might have become of us had we simply accepted the cold distance of that first meeting, rather than choosing to try again despite every difficulty that followed?" Edward considered the question thoughtfully, reaching for her hand with the same gentle familiarity that had defined their marriage for so many years now. "I believe," he said finally, "that some connections, however uncertain their beginning, are simply meant to grow into something real, given enough patience and courage from both hearts involved. We were fortunate, Alina, to recognize that possibility early enough to nurture it properly, rather than allowing fear or old wounds to keep us forever apart." Alina smiled, leaning contentedly into his familiar embrace, grateful beyond measure for every difficult trial and joyful triumph that had shaped their remarkable journey together. Whatever uncertain arrangement had first brought them together, whatever fears and doubts had tested their bond along the way, they had built, through patient devotion and unwavering honesty, a love that had proven itself genuine and lasting, strong enough to weather every storm, warm enough to fill even the quietest corners of a house that had once known only sorrow and silence. As the fire burned low that evening, Edward pressed a tender kiss against Alina's temple, the same gentle gesture he had offered countless times throughout their years together, from that first difficult winter through every joy and challenge that followed. "Thank you," he murmured softly, "for asking me to try again all those years ago, when I had nearly forgotten how to trust in love at all." "Thank you," Alina replied, resting her head against his shoulder with the comfortable ease of a lifetime spent together, "for proving, patiently and completely, that some risks are always worth taking, however uncertain they may seem at their beginning." Outside, the stars emerged slowly across the darkening sky above Ashfield Manor, watching over a home that had learned, through years of patient devotion, exactly what genuine love truly meant. Nearly 25 years after that first rainy evening, when Alina arrived at Ashfield Manor as a frightened bride, an unexpected letter arrived that brought an entirely new chapter into their long, contented story. The letter came from a solicitor in London, informing Edward that a distant cousin, a man named William Ashford whom Edward had met only a handful of times throughout his life, had passed away without direct heirs, leaving behind a modest estate near the northern coast that now, through complicated lines of inheritance, fell to Edward's stewardship. More surprising still, the letter mentioned a young ward the deceased cousin had been raising, a boy of 12 named Thomas, now left entirely without family or guardian. "We must bring him here," Alina said immediately, reading the letter over Edward's shoulder with evident concern. "A child alone in the world with no one left to care for him. We cannot simply leave him to the mercy of strangers." Edward, now a man in his 50s with silver threading through his once dark hair, nodded slowly, though Alina recognized the careful consideration in his expression, the same thoughtful weighing of responsibility she had come to know so well throughout their marriage. "It would mean welcoming a stranger into our household once again," he observed quietly, "much as you yourself once arrived here, uncertain and afraid." "Then we know exactly how to help him feel welcome," Alina said firmly. "We have learned over many years now precisely what patience and genuine care can accomplish, even between people who begin as complete strangers to one another." They traveled to collect young Thomas within the fortnight, finding a quiet, guarded boy who reminded Alina achingly of the man she had married so many years before, careful and distant, clearly braced against further loss after already losing so much in his short life. The journey back to Ashfield passed in near silence, Thomas staring out the carriage window much as Alina herself once had, watching unfamiliar countryside pass by with evident apprehension about the uncertain future awaiting him. Their own children, now grown with families of their own, welcomed Thomas's arrival with genuine warmth, Margaret especially taking to the role of elder sister with characteristic enthusiasm, determined to help the quiet boy feel at home within their large, loving family. Henry, now managing much of the estate's daily affairs alongside his aging father, made a point of including Thomas in various outdoor activities, patiently drawing the boy out of his careful reserve through shared interests in horses and the surrounding countryside. It was Alina herself, however, who found the most success in gently earning Thomas's trust, recognizing in his guarded silence echoes of her own early uncertainty within these very walls. She discovered him one afternoon in the conservatory, staring uncertainly at her collection of painting supplies, and rather than pressing him toward conversation, simply handed him a spare brush and canvas, inviting him to paint alongside her without demanding any explanation or forced cheerfulness. "I am not very good at this," Thomas admitted after several quiet minutes, studying his clumsy attempt at capturing the garden view beyond the window. "Neither was I when I first began," Alina said gently, continuing her own work without pressure. "Skill grows slowly, Thomas, much like trust does, given enough patience and practice." Over the following weeks, that shared quiet time in the conservatory became a regular ritual between them, Thomas gradually opening up in small increments, sharing pieces of his history, his grief over losing the only guardian he had ever truly known, his fear of never finding genuine belonging within this large, unfamiliar family. Alina listened with the same patient attention Edward had once shown her during her own difficult early days at Ashfield, offering neither false reassurance nor dismissive comfort, simply steady, genuine presence. "You remind me of myself many years ago," she told him one afternoon, as autumn light filtered softly through the conservatory windows. "I arrived here just as uncertain as you seem now, married to a man I barely knew, terrified I would never find genuine happiness within these walls." Thomas looked up, evident surprise crossing his young features. "But you seem so happy now, my lady. You and the Duke, I mean. Everyone speaks of how devoted you are to each other." "We are," Alina confirmed, smiling softly at the memory of everything they had built together over the decades. "But that happiness did not arrive easily or quickly, Thomas. It took years of patience, honesty, and genuine effort from both of us, weathering real difficulties along the way before we found the contentment we now share. Trust, real trust, always takes time to build properly." Her words seemed to settle something within the boy, some quiet reassurance that his own uncertain path toward belonging within this family might eventually lead somewhere genuinely warm and secure, however distant that destination currently seemed. Slowly, over the following months, Thomas began to truly flourish within the Ashfield household, his early guardedness gradually replaced by genuine affection for the family that had welcomed him so completely. Edward, watching this transformation unfold with quiet satisfaction, found himself reflecting often on the strange, beautiful symmetry of their family's story. "It seems fitting somehow," he observed to Alina one evening, "that we should find ourselves helping another frightened stranger find belonging within these walls, given how completely you transformed this house yourself, all those years ago." "Perhaps that is simply what genuine love teaches us," Alina replied thoughtfully. "Not merely to find happiness for ourselves, but to extend that same patient care toward others who need it just as desperately as we once did." By the time winter arrived once more at Ashfield Manor, Thomas had become as genuinely beloved a member of their family as any of their own children, his earlier guardedness replaced by comfortable warmth, his artistic talents, nurtured carefully alongside Alina's guidance, blossoming into genuine skill that surprised even his own modest expectations. On a particularly cold evening, as the entire family gathered together before the same fireplace where Alina and Edward's own story had first truly begun so many years before, Alina found herself overwhelmed with quiet gratitude at how completely their lives had unfolded since that uncertain rainy evening of her arrival. Children, grandchildren, and now Thomas as well, all gathered together within walls that had once known only sorrow and silence, now filled instead with laughter, warmth, and the genuine, hard-won love that had grown so patiently between two strangers willing to try again, despite every uncertainty and difficulty that first threatened to keep them apart. "We have built something truly remarkable together," Edward murmured softly, settling beside her as their large, happy family continued their cheerful evening conversation around them. "We have," Alina agreed, resting her head contentedly against his shoulder, watching firelight dance warmly across faces she had come to love so completely over these many years. "And I suspect, given how readily love finds its way into even the most unlikely beginnings, that this story we have built together will continue growing warmer and more beautiful still, for many years yet to come." Outside, snow began falling gently across the quiet gardens of Ashfield Manor, blanketing the estate in the same peaceful winter hush that had once witnessed the earliest tender moments of their unlikely, hard-won love story, now grown into something far greater than either of them could have possibly imagined on that first uncertain evening so many years before. Spring returned once more to Ashfield the following year, and with it came an announcement that filled the household with fresh excitement. Thomas, now a young man of considerable artistic promise, had been accepted into a respected academy in London to further develop his painting alongside some of the finest instructors in the country. Alina felt a swell of pride watching him prepare for this new chapter, remembering clearly the quiet, guarded boy who had once arrived at Ashfield uncertain of ever finding genuine belonging anywhere. "You have given me more than simple shelter these past years," Thomas told her the morning of his departure, his earlier reserve now replaced by open, genuine affection. "You taught me that family is not merely something we are born into, but something patient people choose to build together, given enough time and genuine care." "You have given us just as much in return," Alina replied warmly, embracing him fondly before his carriage departed down the same long drive she herself had traveled so many years before. "This house has grown fuller and warmer for having welcomed you into it, Thomas. Do not forget that, whatever success awaits you in London." As his carriage disappeared beyond the estate's iron gates, Alina turned back toward the manor, finding Edward waiting patiently beside the entrance, his expression carrying the same quiet contentment that had come to define their many years together. "Another chapter beginning," he observed softly, offering his arm as they walked back toward the house together. "Indeed," Alina agreed, glancing once more toward the fresh flowers filling the old vase near the entrance, a tradition she had maintained faithfully throughout every season of their long marriage. "Though I suspect, whatever new chapters life continues bringing our way, we shall face each one exactly as we have faced every challenge before it, together, patiently, and with hearts fully open to whatever genuine love still waits ahead." Edward smiled, pressing a tender kiss against her hand, as they stepped together back into the warm, familiar halls of the home they had built so carefully over decades of patient devotion. Whatever future chapters awaited their family, whatever new strangers might one day arrive seeking the same genuine belonging Alina herself had once found within these walls, their story, built patiently from uncertain beginnings into something genuinely beautiful, would continue growing warmer and richer still, exactly as true love, given sufficient patience and courage, always eventually does.